we're going to get started here. So this is from the book of Exodus. And this is Exodus 23. In English, 3 times a year shall you hold a festival for me. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, as I have commanded you, at the set time in the month of Aviv. For in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. And the feast of the harvest, of the first fruits of your work, of what you sow in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in the results of your work from the field. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the sovereign, the Lord. So this is sort of a summary text from the Torah about what the calendar looks like, what the Jewish holiday calendar is going to look like throughout the year. There's plenty of things that aren't on here. Some of them for historical reasons. Purim hasn't happened yet. Hanukkah hasn't happened yet. And it doesn't include Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But this is what in Hebrew we call the Shlosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage holidays. And you can see here that they're given sort of different terms than we might be familiar with. But this is it's pretty straightforward what's going on here. It's Passover, it's Shavuot, it's Sukkot, and we're told 3 times a year you should all the men at any rate, should appear before God, which means to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, there are a couple of ways that this can be read. One is to say that this is instructive. This is creating what we call a mitzvah daseh, a commandment to do a thing. And so what's the commandment here? Well, there are a few. There's the 3 holidays sort of exist as 3 different mitzvot, 3 different commandments. The celebration, the pilgrimage, the coming, it says, don't come before me empty-handed. So there's an obligation to bring some sort of offering as well. So that's one way to read this text, is to say that it's creating an obligation. It's creating a requirement to do a specific thing, or in this case, 3 specific things. The other way to read it, though, and this might feel like a bit of a reading against the grain, is to say that this is a limiting proposition. This is God, or the tradition, or the Torah, or Moses, or whatever you want to say. This is someone saying, only 3 times a year shall you appear before the Lord. So only on these holidays are you allowed to make a pilgrimage. Are you allowed to celebrate in this particular way? So this is a way of saying these are the Jewish holidays, and if it's not one of these, then it's not a Jewish holiday. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, this list leaves out a few things. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they probably, in the mind of this author, they probably sort of exist as like a subsidiary of Sukkot. It's all just sort of part of the Tishrei set. And as I mentioned, Hanukkah, Purim, they haven't happened yet, so that's why they're not on this list. But like I say, this is not necessarily how you have to read this text. But it's worth noting there have been in our tradition people who point to this text and others like it and say this is the extent of a Jewish holiday expression. And so what do you do when other people, other cultures, other religions are celebrating a holiday around you? Well, it becomes a tricky question. I think we know sort of implicitly we're not going to celebrate their holiday with them if it's making sort of exclusive claims that are counter to what we believe in Judaism. We're not going to go worship another god. We're not going to, bow down to an idol or something like that. There are plenty of things that go with ancient holidays that we're not going to participate in. But then the question is, how far away do you have to stand? what counts as participating and what counts as simply getting along with your life in a world that is, full of diverse opinions, in a world that's largely not Jewish. And so that's the next text that we're going to take a look at here, and then I want to pop out and see what you folks think. So this is Masechet Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah literally it means strange worship, usually translated as idolatry. And this is the beginning of that section in the Mishnah dealing with idolatry. And specifically, I mean, dealing with idolatry is actually pretty straightforward. Don't do it. That's the end. That's the beginning and end of that conversation. Don't do it. But then the question becomes, in a world where people are committing idolatry, in a world that is filled with a lot of different religious expressions, how do you navigate that as a Jew? What do you avoid? And what is okay to engage in? And so that's what's going on here. That's the sort of fundamental question, the meta question behind all of these specific concerns is how do you manage being Jewish in a non-Jewish world, in a non-Jewish environment, in a place where you are not the majority. And so this is the very beginning, and it begins with a conversation about holidays. It says, on the 3 days preceding the festivals of idolaters, it is forbidden to conduct business with them, to lend articles to them or borrow from them, to lend or borrow any money from them, to repay a debt or receive repayment from them. So there's a lot of concern here that engaging in commerce with idolaters is going to lead to idolatry, is going to essentially enable them to do something that they shouldn't do. This concept in the rabbinic tradition is called lifnei iveh, which we take from the injunction in the Torah not to put a stumbling block before the blind. I mean, if you take that verse literally, it's a truly terrible thing to do to a person. The rabbis don't understand it literally. They say that putting a stumbling block before the blind means to enable someone to do something bad, to enable someone to commit a transgression that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. And so that's what's going on here. If I lend money to an idolater 3 days before their big holiday, they are going to go spend that money to buy an animal to sacrifice, or they're going to give the money to their god or to their temple or whatever. And so there's concern about that. Now the question then becomes, what about this thing here where we say we're not allowed to receive a payment from them? Rabbi Judah says we should receive repayment from them, as this can only depress them. But the other rabbis argue, even though it is depressing at the time, they are glad of it subsequently, which later rabbis will say what that means is if they pay off their debt and it's the day before their special holiday, they might use that as an occasion to give an offering to the god of theirs and say, thank you, Zeus, for helping me get rid of my debt, or something along those lines. And so this is a fairly broad ban on engaging in the non-Jewish world, and it has to get scaled back. There's no doubt it needs to get scaled back because it's a very broad ban. It's worth noting. I'm going to pop out here. It's worth noting that the Mishnah is written in the land of Israel, in a majority Jewish culture, in a time and place where most people thought, the sort of dominant voice in the community was Judaism, and so there was less of a concern about interacting with neighbors and more of a concern about the ruling authorities, about the Roman Empire, and this sort of concern about propriety in the face of the ruling empire. This is also a time before the emergence of competing monotheisms. Islam or Christianity. There's no sense in Masechet Avodah Zarah of a third category of human being, someone who's not a Jew but isn't an idolater either. That sort of category, and the question of who that applies to, that is a question for a later generation. The Mishnah isn't really interested in that. The Mishnah produces this very firm bifurcation between Jew and non-Jew, or between Jew and idolater, as they would describe it. And they say, so for 3 days before their and after their holidays, you just don't do any business with them. Just don't do anything that would help them to engage in their holiday. Helping them celebrate their holiday is just as bad as if you had celebrated it yourself. So we're gonna delve into this a little more. Like I say, this text has to get problematized, has to get sort of pared back a little bit, and it's going to be. But I'm just curious to hear what people's thoughts are about this so far. All right, well, we'll keep going then. So I'm going to go back into the text here.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, please, yes.
So this has always been confusing to me about what other religious faiths believe. So is worshiping the same God we worship? So are they really idolaters? And do we have to be so afraid of them?
It's a question that has perplexed the many traditional rabbis and thinkers, and I can't give you an on one foot answer to the question, except to say that it's something that has concerned us for a long time. There are plenty of voices in the Jewish tradition that point to other faiths and say that counts as idolatry. And there are also voices that say, no, not necessarily. You know, there's a sort of middle ground where we say, you know, we don't believe what they believe. We think they're wrong about something, but there's a difference between being wrong about something and it being idolatry. And the question then becomes, you know, what is essential, which of the sort of many beliefs of Judaism are so essential that negating them or denying them would count as fundamentally wrong and idolatrous. And this is actually the enterprise of the Rambam when he comes up with the 13 principles of faith, or however you want to translate that. And so many people are fairly comfortable saying Islam not idolatrous in the slightest. It's a very firm monotheism. We have a difference of opinion about divine revelation and which revelation counts, for lack of a better term. But we don't have a difference of opinion about the nature of God, or about the nature of prophecy, or so many things. There's a great amount of overlap between Christianity, or between Islam and Judaism. Christianity gets a little more complicated because of the Trinity. The Trinitarian concept of God seems so at odds with the Jewish concept of God. There are people who try to make it work. There are people who try to square that circle. I don't think it's particularly successful, but there was a rabbi named the Meiri in France who very famously said that that none of the laws that we just learned apply anymore, because there's no such thing as an idolater at all anymore. Everyone has sort of moved on from idolatry, and the sort of widespread adoption of the modern faiths, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, all of these things, they have. He didn't know from Buddhism, but I think if he had, he probably would have been fairly comfortable saying what I'm saying in his name. These are sort of they have an ethical foundation to their understanding. They see the world as fundamentally an ethical place created with a purpose. And so that's the defining feature that matters the most. And then, you know, the rest is just details. All right, so let's keep going here. We're going to jump back into the text because the Gemara, the later part of the Talmud, is gonna try to explain what's going on here, because we just offered a very broad definition, and we need more specifics. All right, so the Mishnah keeps going by saying these are the festivals of the Gentiles: Calenda, Saturnalia, and Crotesis, and the day of the festival of their kings, and the birthday of the king, and the anniversary of the day of the death of the king. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir lists 6 holidays and says, this is it. These are the non-Jewish holidays. So you are wondering which are the holidays that you can't buy or sell or pay a debt or receive a payment for a debt or any of that stuff 3 days before or 3 days after. I mean, you might have been worried, like there's a lot of holidays out there, you know? Rabbi Meir says, no, there's really only 6 that you have to worry about. One is the birthday of the king, and the other is the festival of the king, which is probably the coronation or the anniversary of the coronation or something like that, and the anniversary of the day of the death of the previous king, perhaps. So that's going to be, you know, culturally specific and dependent on the circumstances. And then he has 3 that he lists here that you know, clearly the author thought we knew what these were. They're Calenda, Saturnalia, and Crotesis. Most of us probably don't know what those are. We're going to learn. We're going to explain what those are in just a second here. But the question, so that's Rabbi Meir's definition. But the rabbis are a little broader. They say every death that includes public burning is a festival that includes idol worship, and any death that does not include public burning, not a festival that includes idol worship. But in this case, the day of shaving beard and lock, the day of his ascent from the sea, the day he left prison, it's also in the case of a Gentile who prepared a wedding feast for his son and celebrates on that day. Engaging in business is prohibited only on that day and with that man. So if someone who is an idolater is engaged in sort of like a personal holiday, a private holiday, it's his son's wedding day or something like that. And so, you know, because it's his son's wedding day, he's going to be going to the temple and offering to Zeus or whatever. So don't engage with him in any business on that day and just that day. So you only have to worry about 3 days before and after for the big holidays, not for the little ones. All right, so now the Gemara is going to try to explain. And I promise you we are getting to Christmas here. I know this has been a bit of a walk, but we're getting to where we're trying to get to. So the Gemara explains, Rav Hanan bar Rava says, when are these festivals celebrated? Calenda is celebrated during the 8 days after the winter solstice, and Saturnalia is celebrated during the 8 days before the winter solstice. And he comes up with a little mnemonic to help us remember that. So this is, you know, it's interesting. I'm going to pop out here. The Mishnah is written in the land of Israel in the 2nd century. So in the Roman Empire, Israel or Palestine was a province of the Roman Empire at that point, and it is very thoroughly marinated in the Greco-Roman culture. And the author of the Mishnah had no doubt that you knew what these holidays were. It's like if I was writing something about how Jews should celebrate the 4th of July. I don't explain the 4th of July. I don't tell you what the 4th of July is. I don't talk about 1776 because I don't need to. I don't need to explain to you folks what the 4th of July is. You all know what the 4th of July is. But now the Gemara, even though we publish them side by side, The Mishnah, the Gemara, they seem like they're, it's just right down the page from one from another. The Gemara is written 400 years later in a different country. So the Gemara is written in Bavel, in Babylonia, in a sort of Persian Empire successor state. And these are people who don't know what these holidays are. And they say, what on earth is Saturnalia? Which is kind of the same position that we're in right now, because we have no idea what these are. We don't celebrate these. And so we're gonna try to break them down a little bit. So one, we can just we can toss aside. We don't need to worry about it for our conversation. Kratesis. Kratesis was probably the celebration that the Emperor Augustus had for his victory over Antony and Cleopatra. He landed in Egypt on the 1st of August. It wasn't called August back then. Perhaps in honor of his landing in Egypt, he renamed the month after himself and said there's going to be a holiday now to mark the defeat. And essentially, Kratesis means power or dominion or something like that. You might recognize that kra root from the word democracy or theocracy. The kra is the same as kratesis, and it means power or control. And so that's August 1st. We don't need to worry about that. Calends, we probably recognize the word calendar in there, right? The calends was connected in some way to the calendar, to the start of the new year, new month, something along those lines. And Saturnalia will recognize the name of the Roman god, Saturn, the father of Jupiter. And so we can get some sort of hints just from what we might know from the wider world. The rabbis of the Middle Ages, they were very confused by these terms. They didn't know what they were because they didn't study the classics. It wasn't until the Renaissance that so much of the Greco-Roman culture was rediscovered, and people began rereading the ancient Greek and Latin texts. And now you can go learn about ancient Roman holidays, and we have a better sense of these things. We have a better sense of what on earth is going on here. And I want to share, so I'll share that with you. Pop back into the text here. So calends is the first day of every month on the Roman calendar. And the word calendar comes from calends. And the Roman month was actually not so different from the Jewish month. The Jewish month with the new moon, it was declared by the Sanhedrin with witnesses. The Roman month was declared in the same way. The Curia Calabra in Rome, this sort of how would you call that? Like the religious body of the city of Rome, they would make a declaration that a new month had started, and this was important religiously and also civically. As you can see, debts were to be paid at the end of the month at the calends, and people would write down the debts that were due to them at the end of the month in a document called the Calendaria, which was an accounting book, and that is where we get our concept of the calendar. So it's a little different just in the way the math was done, but it's basically this particular calends we're talking about is at the end of the month of December and the end of the year by extension. So this is getting us into New Year's Eve. Saturnalia was a celebration of the Roman god Saturn, and it was sort of more or less borrowed from many cultures in the ancient world. They would have a celebration around the time of the solstice, in which things got sort of flipped upside down. So masters became slaves and slaves became masters, and what was forbidden became permitted, And it says the common custom was the election of the king of Saturnalia, who would give orders, and they would just sort of goof around and have fun. Now, if you read Sir James Fraser's Golden Bough, you know that the king of Saturnalia has probably an even darker past, where there was a custom that a king would be killed. There was a custom not to let one person take too much power, and so as a way of keeping keeping people from acquiring too much power, every once in a while they'd have a king, but then they'd kill him at the end of the year. Eventually, the Greeks sort of modify this into election of exile. So they would vote on who they wanted to kick out of the country. And if you got enough votes, you had to leave the country for 10 years. Probably what ends up happening, because obviously the kings don't want this to happen, they don't want to be killed. And so there would be an election of a new king just during this holiday period, and then he would be killed at the end of the holiday period. We see evidence of this in Babylonia, also evidence in Dacia and in modern Romania. And if you like, yeah, as I said, if you've read Fraser's The Golden Bough, you know about this. Joseph Conrad writes about this in modern times in his book Heart of Darkness, made into the movie Apocalypse Now, if you've seen that. Robert Graves writes about this in Ireland, although Graves is a little suspect as a scholar. This is an ancient idea. They get a prisoner, someone who is condemned to death anyway, or a slave in some cases, and it becomes effectively a form of human sacrifice, where they would have this man, and he would be, they call him the king, they treat him like the king, and then at the end of the week they would kill him. Now that this is a sort of extreme example. Most of the time, this sort of thing probably wasn't happening in quite such a brutal way. But this was a society that really didn't value the life of the individual the way ours does. It's worth keeping in mind. So we see here, Saturnalia was the equivalent of the Roman equivalent of the Greek holiday Chronia, which was celebrated in midsummer. So the Roman calendar was a little different. They took theirs to winter. The Greek was in the midsummer. But in both cases, there is there's a sense that things have gotten turned upside down, that the old order of things has gotten mixed up, and what was once bad is now good, and vice versa. And so that's Saturnalia. And if you do the math on these, beginning December 17th, going 8 days, that takes us right up to Christmas Eve. And then Collins begins on December 25th and goes all the way to January 1st. So it takes us all the way to New Year's Day. And I'm going to pop out here. If you look at the New Testament, which I didn't bring, but I'm sure you can find a copy somewhere. The New Testament describes, in the Gospel of Luke, it describes the birth of Jesus as happening in the time when the shepherds were sleeping in their fields. Very famously, an angel comes to visit the shepherds and tells them that the Messiah has been born and they should go visit him. It doesn't have a date. There's no date associated in the New Testament with the birth of Jesus. But it's virtually impossible to imagine that it was December 25th, because that is a very cold and wet time of year in the land of Israel, and shepherds would not be sleeping in their fields. It's very unlikely that it would happen. Scholars who have more of an axe to grind about this than I do, because I don't think any of it happened at all, but some people who think that there's some grain of truth in the New Testament, they point to the star that the Magi followed, being a rare a lineup of Saturn, Jupiter, and Venus in the night sky, which would have occurred in August of the year 6 BCE. So if that's working for you, then it would have happened in August. But it definitely didn't happen in December. And the early church fathers knew this, and they all knew that they were borrowing from Saturnalia. They were borrowing from this pagan holiday. And many of the customs of Christmas come out of these earlier winter solstice holidays, whether it's caroling, Christmas caroling, once a much more raucous event than it is now. Now, if any Christmas carolers stop by, it's going to be very nice and very subdued. It used to be people would just sort of wander around town very drunk, singing songs and begging people for a little bit of food or drink, and it was a little bit more like Halloween, like trick-or-treating, with the implication that we're here at your house, give us some food, otherwise something bad's going to happen. The Yule Log, not especially popular here in this country, but in Scandinavia, comes straight out of pagan mythology. As does the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is very much a pagan icon. Santa Claus, many people think, comes from certain depictions of the one-eyed god Odin, the Scandinavian god of the father of the gods, as he's called in the Scandinavian mythology. Just in terms of the riding with the reindeer and the gift giving and the sort of fearsome suit and there's a lot of imagery getting borrowed from an earlier age. If you go to Wales in the United Kingdom, there are people whose custom is to dress up with animal skeletons, with the skull of deer and sheep and things like this. They put them on their head, and it's terrifying if you don't grow up with it. If you just look at these things, you go, oh, this is very strange. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that this is the darkest time of the year, and human beings are very frightened of that. Human beings are terrified that the sun is dying. And so throughout our history, we have come up with various approaches to deal with that. And in cold climates, like in Europe, this is also a time when people are preparing for the sort of the height of winter. Winter is really just getting going. For many people in traditional societies, winter is a time of death. It's a time of disease. It's a time of cold and hunger. Many people respond to that in different ways, spiritually, religiously. There's also practical considerations. By the time the winter solstice comes along, you know how much fodder you have, you know how much food you have for your animals, and you know how many animals you can feed over the winter. And if you have more than you can feed over the winter, those animals are not going to have a good day. So you slaughter the animals you can't afford to feed during the winter, and then you have a party. Then now you've got a lot of meat all of a sudden, and so this is these are the sort of practical origins of so much of the Christmas celebration. But what I want to pause for thoughts, questions, comments, and then I want to bring you the text that I'm really excited to bring you. About what do we think about this time of year, this winter solstice, how cold and dark it is. It's a fascinating text. But before we get there, are there any thoughts about what we've been talking about so far?
Well, in every culture, not even Judeo-Christian cultures, there is always a festival of lights because of the winter solstice being the burning out of the sun. And it is, even Hanukkah actually didn't historically happen necessarily on the 25th of Kislev. They're saying that that could have come because everybody else was doing a festival of lights. So yeah, it's everybody, you know. Lights turn out, we gotta light something to make sure that it comes back.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's less of a big deal the closer you get to the equator. I mean, if you live on the equator, there's really very little difference between the daylight of December and the daylight of June. But as you get further and further away, these differences start to get pretty stark. It's interesting. I was actually reading some work that a scholar has done on the question of the halachic hour, the Jewish hour, which isn't quite the same as how we do our hours on our phones and our clocks. A halachic hour, you take the amount of daylight in the day and you divide it in 12. And the question was, what did the ancient sources think about how this would work in northern climates? And they really didn't have an opinion on it because they didn't think people could live this far north. They were living, around the Mediterranean Sea. And these were writers in the land of Israel, in Iraq, in Greece, and they say sort of halfway between the equator and the North Pole, that's where humans can live. And if you go too far south, you get into the Sahara Desert. And if you go too far north, you get into the sort of the frozen waste, and no one could live there. No one could live in the latitude of, London and Berlin and Detroit and New York. They just didn't think it was possible. They couldn't imagine that we were gonna do what we're doing now, living so far north. That the sort of extreme difference in the daylight hours would become such a big deal. All right, so speaking of such things, let's jump right in here. So this is, we're sort of coming back to these holidays, to Calenda and Saturnalia, and the rabbis are trying to explain the origin of these holidays. What are these holidays? What's going on here? So they say, with regard to the dates of these festivals, the sages taught when Adam, the first man, saw that the day was progressively diminishing as the days become shorter from the autumnal equinox to the winter solstice. He did not yet know this was a normal phenomenon, and therefore he said, woe is me, perhaps because I sinned, the world is becoming dark around me, and will ultimately return to the primordial state of chaos and disorder. And this is the death that was sentenced upon me from heaven, as it is written, to dust you shall return. So Adam thought the sun is getting a little less bright every day. Every day the sun rises a little bit later and it sets a little bit sooner. And maybe this is the world being snuffed out. Maybe this is the end of the world. This is, God has decreed a punishment for Adam. He's sent out of the Garden of Eden, and he's sent off into the world, and he's trying to figure out how it works. He doesn't know how it works. He's only a few weeks old. Of course, he doesn't know how it works. And so he does a thing that's very common to human beings. When we don't understand something, we make it much more personal than it actually is. We say, oh, is that about me? I hear them whispering. Are they talking about me? I heard people on the bus speaking a foreign language. They must have been making fun of me. We all do this to some degree. We make the world about ourselves much more than it actually tends to be sometimes. And Adam is doing the same thing here. He says, maybe this thing that's happening with the sun is that it's being put out because of my sin. Because of what happened in the Garden of Eden, the world is going back to tohu vavohu. The world is going back to the state of chaos that it was in before the 6 days of creation. And so he does what probably seems pretty natural. It says he arose and spent 8 days in fasting and in prayer. Once he saw that the season of Tevet, i.e. the winter solstice, had arrived, and he saw that the day was progressively lengthening after the solstice, he said clearly the days become shorter and then longer, and that is the order of the world. He went and observed a festival for 8 days. Upon the next year, he observed both of these 8 days, the 8 days on which he fasted and the 8 days of his celebration, as days of festivity. So Adam established these festivals for the sake of heaven, but they, the Gentiles of later generations, established them for the sake of idol worship. So the rabbis are making a really bold claim here that the Roman holidays that they're surrounded by are actually sort of Jewish holidays. Not Jewish per se. Adam and Eve weren't Jewish, but they were, they worshiped the God of Israel. They believed in much of what we believe, and they are trying to address this question of where did these things come from? This is a very human impulse, as we were just discussing. This thing of being afraid because it's getting darker and darker, and you're not sure where it's going to end. You're not sure how long it's going to last. The rabbis here are sort of alighting over a fact that they may not have been aware that, for thousands and thousands of years, people didn't know that the world just worked that way, that there was something mechanical to the way the seasons work, to the way the stars move in the sky. They really didn't know that. It wasn't until the astronomical work of the Babylonians over hundreds of years that people really pinned down with any certainty. This is how the seasons work. This is how the night sky moves in a predictable, complicated but predictable pattern. They thought the sky does what it does, that the sun is a god that operates according to its own will, or that the planets, they move around in different directions because they just want to, and to come up with the rules, to explain the complicated rules that underlie this. It was the work of many, many generations of scholars. And the rabbis are sort of, as part of the Greco-Roman culture, they inherit this labor and this tradition, and they're able to tell this story of Adam very quickly, probably much more quickly than was actually the case for human beings. Adam realizes, oh, this is just the way it works. This is just the natural order of the seasons of the sky, the sun. The days get shorter, and then the days get longer, and that's just part of the operation of the world. But they're ascribing to Adam this knowledge, and they're making these holidays, expressly holidays on behalf of God. They're not exactly Jewish holidays, but they're holidays that we would say, well, that's permitted. Obviously, if Adam is worshiping God, we're more or less okay with what's going on there, but then it says later generations corrupted them for idolatry. This same concept, by the way, if you look in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, where he talks about Avodat Kochavim, the worshipers of the stars, he explains this in the same way, that most of the what we would call the pagan religions, the non-Jewish religions of the world, have a basis in truth that comes from Judaism. This is his explanation. It might not strike us as especially cultured, but if the world begins with Adam and Eve, who have a correct understanding of God, how did things go so wrong? How did the vast majority of the world end up with incorrect beliefs? This is the sort of assumption behind the rabbi's question here, and so they sort of chart this journey where you start doing something for good reasons, and then eventually the ritual is preserved and the reason is lost, and it ends up becoming a holiday celebrated for idolatry. And so Is it a bit of a reach to say that Adam and Eve were celebrating Christmas? Yeah, I'd say that's a bit of a reach. That might be too far of a reach, but I don't think it's ridiculous either. If you think of Christmas being the modern incarnation of the winter solstice holiday, whether it's Saturnalia or whatever term you want to use. The rabbis are making the case here that this is fundamentally human. This is not about Adam as a person. This Adam here sort of standing in for all human beings and saying, yeah, human beings are afraid of the dark and they're terrified that the sun is about to go out. And then the question is, how do you respond to that? What do you do in response to that reality? Do you start doing human sacrifice? Do you start fasting and repenting and worshiping God? Is it something in between? That might not be automatic. That might not be human, but the concern is very human. All right. Any thoughts about this? Questions, comments, concerns?
I once heard a story. I don't know if this is true, but a group of Jewish scholars were meeting with a group of Christian scholars, and they were debating who has the true religion. And one of the wise Jewish scholars said, "Look, we have to think about what we can agree on. We both agree that we believe in the Mashiach. You think he's already come. We think he's going to come. There's no sense in arguing about it now. When he comes, we'll ask him, is this the first time or the second time? But until then, there's no point in arguing this."
That's a nice idea. We'll give it a shot. See how it works out. All right. I want to share with you. We only have a few minutes left. I want to share. We'll go through this a little quickly, but I promised you we jump a few generations into the future, maybe more than a few here. So that's what's going to happen right now. So this is from Shabbat 23b. And it says Rav Yitzhak ben Redifa said that Rav Huna said lighting an oil lamp that has two spouts is considered as having fulfilled the obligation of kindling the Hanukkah light for two people. And then similarly, if you take a bowl and put wicks all around it and you and then you light it, that's good enough for many people. But he says overturning a vessel atop the bowl, by overturning, each wick appears to be burning independently. If you didn't turn it upside down, though, then the wicks are just sort of floating in the bowl. That makes it look like a bonfire. And it is not a kosher Hanukkah menorah if it looks like a bonfire. And then the question is why? Why is this a problem? So Rashi says it's a fire that joins in the middle and it doesn't look like a lamp, which the bonfire was a very common custom in the Greek world to mark the winter solstice. And so it's the same time of year, we're doing the same thing. We're responding to the darkness by lighting some lights, but we are doing it not only in a way that's distinctively Jewish, but that honors not only this sort of human impulse, but also honors our historical connection to previous generations. So we are making it look like the menorah in the temple. And by doing it in that distinctively Jewish way, we might be answering a human impulse by bringing light into darkness, but we don't just do it however we want to do it. We don't just do it like anyone else does it. We do it in a particularly Jewish way. So I'd love to talk more about that, but for the sake of time, I do want to move on to this survey here. So there's a little overview here about the history of Christmas Day and Judaism. So on Christmas Day, it was customary not to go to the yeshiva, not to go to the Beit Midrash, and not to study Torah. So instead, on Christmas night and on Christmas Day, Even the most pious Jews who would normally be at the synagogue or at the yeshiva, they would be studying Torah. They would instead play cards. They would play chess. They'd just kind of hang out at home. This goes way back. Probably the answer is fairly practical, which is that it wasn't safe to be out on Christmas Day if you were Jewish. Although there are other sort of more mythological explanations that people would stay home and avoid studying Torah for fear that it was a day that they this is not a nice thing what I'm about to say. This story I'm about to tell you, I just want to preface it by saying this probably isn't how we relate to our Christian friends and family these days, but it wasn't a good relationship that we had in the Middle Ages, and it gets expressed by the rabbis of that generation that they thought that Jesus of Nazareth had been cursed. And that part of his curse was that he would come back on Christmas Day, and they didn't want him to overhear words of Torah that could be instrumental in his repentance. This is actually a fairly tame version that I'm describing to you now. The version that you find in books like Toldot Yeshu is much more graphic and extreme, and it's unpleasant if I'm being real honest with you. But it's the sort of unpleasant imaginings of a powerless people, of a people who are not in a position to do anything that they're describing, who are just reveling in their imagination because it's all that they have. And like I say, probably it was more practical. They had to stay home because it wasn't safe. So what ends up happening, though, is as the Enlightenment spreads across Europe, a sort of nominal observance of Christmas becomes sort of part and parcel to entry into wider society. And so we see this in the Austrian Empire. We see this in Germany. The German Jews especially took to the celebration of Christmas. It had absolutely no religious content for them. It was just a way of sort of marking their integration into the wider society. You see, even Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, grew up celebrating Christmas at home. They roast goose or hare, not a kosher animal, of course, a decorated Christmas tree and presents, and they would sing. They would sing Silent Night, and this all sounds very German. I grew up in my grandmother was a German speaker, and I grew up singing Silent Night in German. And so this all feels very, very familiar. And it was, like I say, it was not a celebration of anything religious. It was just a celebration of being in the wider culture. This same thing ends up happening for the generation of Jews who come to the United States, the great Jewish migration beginning in 1882 and ending in 1924, for which most American Jews are descended, at least in part, from people who came during that time period. And their children, the second generation, really took to Christmas. They really took to Christmas as an expression of Americanness. And so we see, starting in the 1950s, Jewish sociologists are doing studies. Always interesting to see the results of the studies, but sometimes just as interesting to see that this was thought to be worth studying in the first place. I mean, that can be your first clue that something interesting is going on here. And so we see the second generation of Jewish migrants to America being the ones who really took to the secular celebration of Christmas, the Christmas tree, the presents, this sort of thing. And it was a way, just as it had been in Germany, it was a way of marking their integration into the wider culture. And it was in a sense, it was a way of marking something that seemed less than obvious. This was their way of making a definitive statement against what might have seemed like a more factual case. And this is often the case for the children of immigrants. They end up sort of overcompensating in a sense, or overemphasizing their Americanness, or whatever country they were born in that their parents weren't. By the time you get to the third generation, the Arnold Eisen study here in 1993, most Jewish families have stopped bringing Christmas trees into the house. The third and fourth generation of American Jews take their Americanness for granted, no longer see Christmas as a quintessentially American celebration, and don't see that this is sort of an expression of their integration into society. Instead, this is the generation from the 60s onward that really emphasizes Hanukkah, really kind of goes all in on Hanukkah as, and I'm only speaking sociologically here, this is Hanukkah as a Jewish Christmas. This is a way of sort of getting what you get out of Christmas, but getting it in a Jewish way. The question that we are asking now, the question that modern rabbis and Jewish thought leaders wrestle with now, isn't about should a house where both parents are Jewish and both parents are born Jewish, should that house have a Christmas tree? That's not really happening anymore. Not really. Not so much for the Jewish families that have been in the US for a long time. It is a little bit happening still with Jews from the former Soviet Union. And that's a very different cultural valence. For them, the Christmas tree was a celebration of New Year's Day in the Soviet Union. It's very different. But it's not so much now a question of Christmas as an expression of Americanness, as it becomes a question of Christmas as one expression of interfaith family conviviality. You celebrate Christmas alongside Hanukkah, and both parents get their holiday in the mix, or something like this. Or in the case of families where there are, where conversion to Judaism is a reality, it becomes a question of Christmas with the grandparents or Christmas with the extended family. How do you negotiate these things? How do you negotiate a childhood memory of Christmas time, and what do you pass on to your kids? How do you with a new Jewish person, a person newly Jewish, how do you help them negotiate their place in the Christmas conversation that the Jewish people have been having for hundreds and thousands of years? All right, that was a lot right there at the end. I want to jump back out before we go. Any thoughts about this? Questions, comments, stories of your childhood Christmas trees? Anything at all?
Well, I remember my mother, who was an immigrant from the Ukraine, talking about Christmas and Easter as being very difficult times, because, as she would say, the Goyim would come out of church and get drunk and accuse us of killing their God. So we had to lay low and hide out.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yep. And there's in Poland and Belarus and Ukraine still today, even though there are hardly any Jews because of what happened, there is still a custom it's sort of changed a little bit. It's now, the custom is on Easter, it's good luck to touch a Jew. It used to be on Easter, it's good luck to punch a Jew. So that's gone a little more gentle. And now that there are no more Jews, they sell statues. They sell little statues of Jews for people to touch on Easter. It's very disturbing, honestly. Even now that the Jewish life is so largely wiped out in these parts of the world, but it's still there. That hatred is still there. It's very disturbing.
I find that it's always interesting that people say, they compare Hanukkah to Christmas, except Hanukkah is about not assimilating. And those who say that it is the Jewish Christmas, they're just doing exactly the opposite. They're trying to assimilate. And I'm a second generation American, and my parents, my grandparents, as far as I know, none of them, the only way that we would celebrate Christmas was that we would go and look at what we called OPL, other people's lights, and laugh about how pretty it was. And I'm really glad they're paying for it. So, but yeah, I mean, it was, even the thought that some people decorate their houses for Hanukkah with lights outside, that was something in our family we would never do, because it would make it look like we were assimilating and trying to be, even though we had the Festival of Lights, but trying to be like them.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's fair. Although I also think it's worth, it's worth remembering that, how did we remember the miracle? We remembered it by instituting a candle lighting, which was so similar to the Greek bonfires that we had to be very specific about how to do it in our own particular way. And how did we remember the specifics of what happened at that time? We wrote 4 books about it, all of which were in Greek. So I think, to say that it's just about not assimilating, or that's the obvious or simple message. I think again, it's a little more complicated.
Well, it's interesting how over time, in each generation, it's taken on different meanings, depending on where you are and what your what the circumstances are between the Jewish community and the Gentile community around them.
Oh, absolutely. And like when I lived in Israel, Israeli Hanukkah is completely different from American Hanukkah. American Hanukkah is all about the miracle of the oil, and it's very clear that the rabbis were sort of trying to de-emphasize the military nature of the story, probably because they were writing in the Roman Empire. Whereas in the modern state of Israel, it's all about the military story. It's all about the victory of the Maccabees and the victory of this, this scrappy little country with its small but mighty army. And it's got a very different feel than American Hanukkah.
So I grew up in one of those German Jewish families, and my husband is definitely Russian, Eastern European, and seriously, our families, I think on both sides, felt like we were intermarrying, because my grandparents, one set of grandparents, did have a Christmas tree in this country and had goose for dinner. Just
absolutely, yeah, it was very common.
And they celebrated that way in Germany. But my father's side of the family, who also was German, were definitely never celebrating with a Christmas tree, even though they live in Germany. So even within German society, there was a great deal of conflict over that.
Right.
And here in this country, it stopped. My grandparents stopped having a Christmas tree when we both married men who were like, "This is so weird. There's no way I'm ever coming over."
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I used to be a long time ago. I was engaged to someone who didn't work out, but we were together for a long time, and her family had a Christmas tree, and then at a certain point they decided, we're not going to do the Christmas tree anymore, but they still did stockings. They still did presents hanging from the stocking. And then one year I came over and I said, "Hey, where's the stockings?" And she said, "Oh, I was talking to my sister, and we decided," her sister who had married an Israeli, "we decided we're not going to do that anymore." So
yeah. I do think it comes up as a really difficult subject when children, intermarry, and I see that as being a very tough issue. And,
Oh yeah, it's hard. It's very hard. I think it's especially hard in the in the Christian or sort of nominally Christian context, there aren't a lot of holidays. There's Christmas, kind of Easter maybe, and that's it. And so to say, I'd like you to give up your one holiday. It's tough. It's a tough one to give up. From my point of view now, I look back and I see. I don't know. I'm not trying to make any big claims here, but from my point of view, I'm really happy with such a big calendar with so many holidays that we get to celebrate, and each one has its own feel. And I feel like there's sort of a poverty in other traditions where there's just this one big holiday.
Mm-hmm. This has been very interesting. An amazing long course of history and writings about this. Who knew that?
There's a lot to it. Yeah. And we're gonna come back together. I think I'll see a lot of you before then, but we're gonna have another lunch and learn in 2 weeks on the subject of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. I might talk about a little about this stuff, about the Saturnalia and Colin stuff. But mostly it's going to be about what we can learn about our various New Year's days on the Jewish calendar. We actually have more than one. We've got a few New Year's days, and what we can learn from seeing how other people approach their holidays. So I hope some of you can join us in 2 weeks on Friday the 31st. Yeah, New Year's Eve. At this time, and I'm sure I'll see a lot of you before that as well. So thank you.
Thank you.